Hi everyone, this is Navyata and thank you so much for joining us today. In this episode of the Diff, we'll discuss how to build intuitive interactions in VR using the Interaction SDK and learn more about what Presence platform offers. And with me today is Danny, who's a software engineer on the Interaction SDK team, to tell us more about Presence platform and how we can use Interaction SDK to add natural interactions in our own VR experiences. Hi Danny, it's great to have you here with us. Could you please tell us a little about yourself and your work?
Yeah, it's great to be here. So I'm Danny. I'm a software engineer here on the Input Frameworks team at Meta. My team works on building interaction models and interaction systems for really spatial mediums. Is that VR, MR, um, but both for third parties and our internal teams here at Meta. This includes interaction models for both controllers and hands, things like interacting with rays, direct touch, poking at buttons, grabbing, as well as several showcases that demonstrate interactions like these, uh, like the Interaction SDK Samples app and the Firsthand Showcase app.
Thanks for the introduction, Danny. You mentioned the First Hand Showcase app. Let's talk a little bit about that. Could you tell us what this Showcase app is about and how it works?
Yeah. So Firsthand is a showcase app that lets you experience some of the magic of hands and hands interactions in a really fun way. In Firsthand, you get to play with a few switches and levers, a holographic tablet, all while you're solving puzzles in this kind of virtual world. Um, in this app, you get to build yourself a pair of robotic gloves and kind of play with the superpowers that comes with that. But along the way, you get to test all of these different interactions and interaction paradigms that you might find in the Interaction SDK, such as direct touch and grab. Um, on top of like Firsthand, we also have the Interaction SDK Samples app, which similarly lets you test these kinds of interactions, but more so demonstrates them in the context of the same samples that you might find in the Interaction SDK. Uh, that's kind of an easy way to try several of them for yourself without even having to open Unity, and really just test the entire set of things that we offer with the Interaction SDK.
That is awesome. It's great to see a real world example, like showcasing how all these interactions work and how developers can use these in their own games. So, the first hand sample that you mentioned, like how do developers get access to it?
Absolutely. Both Firsthand and the Interaction SDK Samples app are available for free to download on AppLab. When it comes to the code itself, there's two resources you can follow. For the Interaction SDK, you can download that as part of the Oculus all-in-one integration package. And for the Firsthand showcase, we actually have a slice of some of the interactions that we've built in that app that are available to download on GitHub.
Wow, Interaction SDK can make VR experiences so much more immersive. What are some of like the challenges that arise when developing hand interactions in VR? And like how does Interaction SDK help resolve some of them?
Yeah, hands are really this kind of incredible input. They're they're both something familiar, but not quite, because when you start putting hands into virtual experiences, there are some things that you miss from real life or from a physical interaction that you kind of have to make up for when you get into the virtual world. Some of these things um, some of the ways that you make up for these differences, for instance, not being able to physically touch something for when you're doing direct interaction, there are ways that you can change the visuals or the heuristics to still make it feel compelling and still feel realistic in a virtual environment. So, like the one I just mentioned for direct touch, when we interact with virtual buttons, our hands will normally not stop at a physical surface. Um, there is no physical surface to stop at when you're in virtual reality. So, in Interaction SDK, one of the things that we provide is something called touch limiting. And this is purely a visual affordance that makes it seem like your virtual hand stops at this virtual surface, even if your tracked hand goes beyond it. And so, touch limiting is one such example. Another example is in hand grab. When you grab objects, and you pick them up, a virtual object, your fingers will probably go through the virtual object. But this doesn't seem right when in the physical world. And really, if I'm picking up something like a vase or something physical, I kind of want my fingers to conform around the object. And so my tracked hand in this case will likely close and feel natural, have that self haptic response, but the hand grab visual will reposition the visual hand joints to be around the vase itself. So these are kind of the first step in kind of bringing hands into a virtual environment, really making up for this lack of physical objects and virtual visuals that you need to provide. But on top of that, there's kind of other considerations that you really have to do. You have to take into account latency. You have to take into account the fact that when you are doing um, interactions with a input device that's effectively driven by computer vision, there is going to be some amount of delay between when you uh, do an action and when you get a response back.
Yeah, I mean, adding hands into your experiences like just makes it so natural because we're all used to using hands to like pick things up, touch things. So it just makes sense to have that and that as a natural way of interaction. But like, so now that you have hands in your VR experiences, you can have gestures, you can have poses. So how does Interaction SDK help users who want to integrate like gestures and poses into their apps? Like, how does it make it easier for them to like start?
Yeah. So on top of all of the interactions that we've already discussed, Interaction SDK natively includes a lot of pose detection and gesture detection tools. And what this means is that on top of the hands APIs that you get with the Oculus All-in-One integration, which can give you things like joint rotations and positions, Interaction SDK allows you to add a layer on top of that. And so if you want to detect a certain kind of pose, you can configure a pose recognizer to check for the orientation um, uh, and finger features of a hand, as well as the orientation and transformation of a wrist. And you can add a bunch of these features together to get to something like pose detection. A really good example of that is to think of something like a thumbs up. If you want to detect a thumbs up in Interaction SDK, you can combine two things. This is both a shape recognizer and a transform recognizer. The shape recognizer will be something where you can configure and say, hey, I want the thumb to be extended and I want all my other fingers to be curled. And when this is true, that's part of the thumbs up. The other part is to make sure that we actually orient the hand in the correct orientation. This is definitely not a thumbs up. And so if we take a transform recognizer on top of that, that's something that will check the orientation of the wrist. We can configure it to say, hey, we want the wrist to be facing towards this direction, and anything outside of that, we won't count as recognizing that wrist for the thumbs up. Once we have what is effectively like a boolean for the wrist and a boolean for the fingers of your hand, we can add those two things together and we can get a pose detection for a hand. Now, on top of pose detection, the next logical step is gesture detection. And in much the same way, like we have these components that you can configure to detect shape and orientation, you can also have components that detect poses over time. And that may be a component that checks for velocity in a certain direction over time, or it may be a component that combines several poses and says, as long as you move from pose A to pose B to pose C over a certain span of time, then to signal that that's a gesture. So in Interaction SDK, there's a whole set of components that are specifically built for pose and gesture detection and really are focused around enabling you to define your own, configure your own setup to both do one-handed, two-handed poses as well as gestures.
Wow, I can't wait to try these new features out. Thank you so much for the helpful insights, Danny, and thank you for all the amazing work that you and your team do. And with that, we'd like to conclude this episode of The Diff. Thank you, Danny, for providing us with such great insights into presence platforms, interaction SDK features, and all the super useful resources to help our developers get started with adding interactions and hand tracking in VR. Thank you so much for all the amazing work that you and your team do. It was great having you here.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's it for today. Thank you so much, Danny, for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.